Hey everyone, Steven Records here with Fin Fly Fishing, and today we're going to be talking about the benefits of a balanced fly rod.
No way! Yes! Yeah! Mr. Brown. Oh. Solid, dude.
So there is a reason why virtually any fly shop you go into is going to try and get you a rig that is balanced. It's because it gives you the best performance out of your gear. Here we're going to be talking about the overall benefits, discussing the specific mechanics at play, and how each one of those mechanics ends up benefiting you out on the water. So in case you're unfamiliar with what a balanced fly rod is, essentially you should be able to grab the rod wherever is most comfortable on the grip. Typically that's going to be about a ½ inch to an inch from the top. And then, however you typically cast, you'll essentially try and balance it on that very front finger. For me, I like having my index finger there. Some guys like to put their index finger forward, so then it would be their middle finger. Wherever that is positioned on the rod, you're going to try and balance it as a fulcrum point there. So you'll just basically release the rod, and the rod should stay relatively level when you do that, so it's balanced. Now, if the rod tip ends up going up to the sky or it falls down to the ground, then the rod is off balanced and needs some adjustments. So the first component that we want to talk about is the overall distribution of weight in the rod. If a rod is off balance, then it's going to either be tip heavy or it's going to be too heavy in the back. If you kind of translate this into something more exaggerated, like holding a sledgehammer and trying to swing that at a 10 o'clock and a 2 o'clock. Now a sledgehammer essentially is just incredibly off balance. It doesn't have good weight distribution. And because of that, when you're swinging at a 10 o'clock and a 2 o'clock, it's going to want to follow the momentum. It's going to be hard to stop and to move back, and that's because it's tip heavy. Now, if you were to translate that into something that's well balanced, like let's say a sword of equal weight, that's going to be significantly easier to control simply because of how the weight is distributed across the item that you're holding and trying to control. And the same thing happens when you are casting with an imbalanced rod. When you have an imbalanced rod, then that's going to end up essentially being harder to control because of the off balance in the weight distribution, and it's also going to be something where the rod gets destabilized during the transitional periods of your cast back and forth. Now, if you have a balanced rod though, then it's so much easier for you to be able to control that, and it's going to be something where the rod is able to stabilize and recover quickly in between the forward and the back cast. Now, essentially what happens is when your rod is imbalanced, you end up having a much longer time period where your rod tip is bouncing up and down. It's kind of jiggling back and forth until eventually it stops, and that's when it's stabilized. But when your rod tip is balanced, when your rod is completely balanced, it's able to recover that time much faster. So you're getting better performance out of your rod, because really the best rods are those that are able to recover very quickly at the end of that cast. And the benefits that has ends up essentially affecting you in a few different ways. One is the overall accuracy of your cast. When that rod tip is going up and down, your line is following along with it, and you're unable to get as accurate of cast if that is swaying back and forth up and down whenever you're trying to shoot out that line for too long. The second benefit really relates to the Euro nymphers and tight liners out there. Whenever that rod tip is bouncing up and down, you're in contact with those flies, so the flies are following suit. They're going up and they're going down too. And that looks incredibly unnatural in the water when that's happening. So the sooner that your rod tip is able to stabilize, the longer your drift can be with a natural presentation. The third mechanic that's at play is pretty obvious. Whenever your rod is balanced, it's well balanced. That means that just like a scale, when I release that at a fulcrum point, it stays straight. If it's unbalanced, then it's going to have a tendency for that rod tip to either fall to the ground or to go up to the sky. And that makes your rod tip very hard to control. And whenever you're doing something like tight line nymphing or Euro nymphing, or anything where you're in contact with the flies, like streamers, where you essentially have that rod tip and where it goes, your flies go, that ends up becoming really, really important to have control over where your rod tip is. Because if your rod tip has a tendency to go down, then essentially you're going to be fighting that all day, and it's going to be hard to keep that where you want it during the drift. Or if it has a tendency to go up, the same thing is happening. You're having to fight to get that where you want it in terms of whether you want to lift it up a little bit, or you want it down, or you want to adjust the presentation and give a little bit of finesse to maybe give some more action and animation to your flies or your streamers in the water. Even if you're dry fly or indicator nymphing, this can also reduce the chances of you introducing drag into your drift. The reason for that is whenever you have your rod imbalanced and you're fighting that where that rod tip is controlled, if your line is relatively taut or you've just pulled out slack and then you end up having that sway motion happening, then you end up pulling line off the water, which introduces the drag into your drift. Now, if you're wondering if your rod becomes off balance whenever you're doing those mid to long range casts, the answer is not really. You see, whenever you end up having a balanced rod, you're able to grip the rod in an ideal location, so you have enough headroom at the top of the grip to slide your hand up a little bit to make any micro adjustments to your overall balance in the rod before and after the cast. In addition to this, fly line just doesn't weigh enough for those adjustments to not do the trick. As you can see here, we pulled out over 10 foot of leader material in addition to over 30 feet of 4-weight fly line, floating fly line, and the overall weight of that was less than 9 grams. That is not going to end up being enough weight to off balance your rod when it comes to the adjustments that you can make to your overall hand position when it's balanced at the beginning. And lastly, when you have an imbalanced rod, you end up having to have a death grip on the handle all day long in order to keep it into place, in order to make those casts. So you end up overworking yourself, tensing up all your arm muscles throughout the day, which ends up causing more fatigue, and it wears you out and gives you a sore arm at the end of the day. But when your rod is balanced, instead of having that tight grip all day long, you can just gently cradle the rod. And so that loosens up all of your muscles and makes it to where you're experiencing less fatigue and you're able to spend more time enjoying yourself out in the water instead of tiring out your arm from an imbalanced rod. So there you have it. The benefits of a balanced fly rod really come down to improving the overall performance of your gear and your comfort out on the water. If you want to try balancing out your rod yourself, we have a video on how to do that that takes just a few seconds to do, and you can find that video in the description. Now don't forget to like, subscribe, and tight lines, and God bless.